ecumenical. I will drink anything that's good.
So how are you going to get it down from 52 to 4?
This is the challenge, particularly because some of the 52 are probably no longer being made,
Hmm.
or I can only sample them at the monastery. But it's a good, it's good to have a passion and a lifetime goal.
Exactly.
Mike, do you have to become a monk? Are there beers that the monastery will only give to residents and not to visitors?
It used to be that way, I'm sure.
Yeah,
There still are a few that you have to go to the monastery to buy,
yeah.
but
Well,
slowly
this
they're all
is
going commercial.
this is the beer-oriented start of the Open Global Mind community call for Thursday, August 28th,
If
2025.
anybody,
Welcome.
if anybody's interested at some point, not today, but in the iPhone came out in '07, so probably
Hmm.
talking a couple of years when the apps became a thing. I wanted to write an app, so I proposed to a cider. I had a connection to one of the biggest cider manufacturers here in the UK, and I put a presentation together for an app to allow, obviously, the brewery, let's call it, connect to the people, but also had a whole load of features that were actually, I thought, quite interesting. They never went for it. I don't think anybody's ever written it, but I would fancy it'd still be a pretty good one.
Well,
To
Untapped will allow you to rank the ciders that you drink as well, and they have uh, information on them. But the great thing about the app is you never have to drink substandard beer. You show up at a bar in Nicaragua or Sri Lanka, and you can kind of go through the beer list and determine which ones are, at least a 3.7.
They should add a little feature where you can take a picture of the menu and it'll just overlay the Untapped ratings for you.
Oh. Well, Vivino does that for wine. So you
I
take a
didn't know that.
picture, take a picture of the label, and it automatically pulls up the vineyard and the year, and it's pretty cool. It's not as
That
fun
seems
as
pretty
Untapped
smart.
though, because beer is more fun than wine.
Well, we are all about sense making on today's call, and this is sense making about bacteria created beverages that we love. Um, and so it's interesting. I'm nominally one of the reasons OGM even exists is as an exercise in or an exploration of.
And the weather tech mats.
Doug, I just muted you. Oh, except you just unmuted you. There we go. Good. So nominally, we're exploring the space of sense making, and sometimes we're doing some sense making. Sometimes we're just doing a salon. I'm not exactly sure, but I want to kind of explore that space. And I think several of you have strong feelings in different directions, so I'd love to bring those into the conversation. But I wanted to start with your frustrations around sense making. Just let's do a little go and talk just around frustrations around sense making, which could include it's impossible.
Yeah.
I mean, it could easily include that. John, please, you first.
Okay, let me get unmuted here. Just a second.
Sweet, we hear you fine.
Oh, you can hear me. Okay, great.
Yes, yes.
Well, when on the one hand, at the positive extreme, there is this glorious situation that can happen when people who trust each other, maybe not 100%, but 90%, and don't exactly know what they're talking about or agree, but kind of discover, hey, wait a minute, your idea is missing this and this and this, and my idea is, and you see something that neither one of you saw, or no one in the group saw ahead of time, and you say, wow, because we're together, we can put this together. And it's not a complete solution, but it's something novel none of us thought of, and it's a pointer, it's a sign. It says, hey, go over here, go look in this direction. This is something you ought to check out. And so that's the positive. And when that happens, wow, you say it might all be worth it. But the other extreme, which is where we spend much more of our time, is, hey, we like 95% agree, but somehow we can only come up with this little tiny 5% little, not, motherhood statement that we agree on. And it's like so limited. It's like, well, wait a minute. Is that all we can come up with? Well, objections to everything else, And, there's a little inroad being made by AI because it can look at the statements that we're making and say, yeah, you thought you were really far apart, but actually there's a theme here that you're not seeing, which is connects you. So that's a possibility. But those are what I see as the continuum, the great breakthrough which is the reason why people collaborate with people, even with people they don't like. And then at the other extreme is where we spend most of our time, where we kind of agree, but we can only come out with a motherhood statement.
Great, thanks, John.
Okay.
Marc-Antoine.
Yeah, well, first, absolutely true. I mean, the point of collective intelligence to me, let me start with collective intelligence and I'll get into sense making, is the diversity of perspectives. Like the world is more complex than any one person can understand. So you need the diversity of perspectives to understand the world, including other people which are part of that complexity. And the difficulty of reaching consensus. And it's well known, start with divergence and then come to convergence. And I think so much time in sense making is spent in exploration, and that's absolutely necessary. You cannot converge if you haven't explored and negotiated and spend the time to empathize with the other standpoint and to fully understand it. And at some point, there needs to be a process where you say, okay, let's see, can we make anything out of that either we all agree on or that some of us can agree to work with? Sometimes that's enough, right? It's if some people say, okay, we can bring this forward. Like for me, collective intelligence, which I've distinguished squarely from crowdsourcing, which is, this aggregation without iteration. And collective intelligence, iteration has to be part of it. And improving on one another's ideas. And that's, again, takes time. But being able to be strict about, let's go from this big map making, which is important, to decision making. I once was with a committee that defined, or Simon Buckingham proposed a definition of collective intelligence as collective sensing, collective sense making, collective ideation, collective decision, collective action, and then you loop on that. I think those are all important. But to go from the ideation to decision, you need to be able to pick out elements of the map and decide, okay, we'll focus on this, we'll agree on that, this is out of scope, and this is only possible if you have a goal. It's nice to map, but unless, and sometimes you don't have a common goal to start with, but if people have a goal and then negotiating the goal may be part of the process, but at some point you have to say, we're not just trying to sense make, though that's important, we're also trying to say, what do we do out of this? And the reality is a lot of sense making also happens in practice, in working together, in living the action together, because it's the iteration that's the learning, and it's the learning that's the sense making. Over.
Thanks, Marc-Antoine. And I want to gently herd us toward the frustrations we have with this, not to go defining the space yet, and talking about the deeper issues, because I know we have a lot of people who have really great ideas about what this is. Just can we stay on the frustrations? Like what's frustrating about sense making, whether it's individual or collective or anything like that? Mike, please.
I'm going to go right to that by building on what Marc-Antoine just said.
Perfect.
In addition to having a goal, you really desperately need a deadline or some higher power that is pushing people towards some kind of consensus. A lot of my negotiating experience, or at least my most frustrating negotiating experiences, have been negotiating over legislation in the US Congress, and worse, negotiation about various policy statements and conferences at the United Nations. For instance, I was on the organizing committee for the Internet Governance Forum. And that was actually about as good as it gets in the UN system because there was a deadline. You were going to have a conference on a certain day in a certain place, and you had to put a schedule together and you had to get speakers. In contrast, there's something called the World Summit on the Information Society. This was first held more than 20 years ago in Geneva and then in Tunis. And they were going to kind of scope out what the UN's role was in the digital future. And unfortunately, there wasn't a common goal. I mean, we sort of pretended there was a common goal, which was to develop some principles that, would apply in cyberspace. The US was basically saying what applies in real space applies in cyberspace, things like human rights. But the Chinese had a different goal. Their goal was to water down the famous UN Human Rights Declaration from the 40s. Other people were there because they liked going to meetings. And particularly the guy from Tehran and from Syria. I mean, these meetings meant a whole week expense paid in Geneva. We were supposed to have 3 meetings. These guys made sure we had 5 meetings by just constantly throwing up objections. And that leads to my conclusion about the largest frustration. And I think Marc Antoine referred to this, and that is that you need complete consensus. Nobody objects. Well, that doesn't work. I mean, it allows 1 or 2 people to torque the whole process and hold everybody else hostage. And that just kept happening in these UN meetings. So instead, I recommend what the Internet Engineering Task Force does, which is rough consensus and running code. And so when they develop a standard, in order to assess whether all the people in the room are on the same page, they hum. And so if somebody has put forward a proposal, they will then let the room, after discussion, they will let the room hum. And if there is an overwhelmingly loud hum and just a minor dissenting hum, that's rough consensus. And the test then is does it work? And so usually in order to get support and to get people to hum with you, you have to show that this actually works and works with other standards that the IETF has done. So that's sort of my ideal of sense making. And I'm biased. I'm a techie geek. I spent many years at IBM and elsewhere involved in the IETF. But the reason they hum is because people might show up wearing a Cisco badge or an IBM hat, and the corporate position might be different than theirs. But as an engineer, they hum for the best technical solution, even if it doesn't help their company. And humming gives them anonymity. Long talk, but hope that's helpful.
Thank you, Mike. And we're drifting again into solutions and what seems to work as opposed to just frustrations. If I can keep us on frustrations for just a wee bit longer until we've put a couple good ones on the table. There's a couple good ones showing up in the chat. I think Eric was talking about lack of shared context due to filter bubbles. That's a great frustration. Gil, please.
If I can add one more, and that is just pervasive disinformation. You waste a lot of time trying to fix that problem.
So when there's people actively trying to make sure that sense can't be made, that's a biggie. Yep. Gil.
Yep. I love the humming, Mike. Thank you for that. Even if it maybe is a solution. Your discussion of the people who wanted the meetings to go on longer because there were expenses paid reminds me of the COP, the Conference on the Parties Around Climate, which is coming up in Belém in Brazil shortly, where there will be 600 actual decision-forming delegates and 100,000 other people, overwhelming the city of Belém, many of whom are there on expense accounts and happy to be there for whatever purpose. Frustrations. So I'm frustrated with this conversation. And I put a comment in the chat that I thought might be seen as flippant, but it was really serious, which is I'm not clear what we mean by sense that we are sense making about. I'm not clear what we mean by sense. Does sense mean coming to an interpretation of, quote, reality that is somehow satisfying to me or furthers my expectations or cares or concerns? Does sense making mean coming to some kind of shared interpretation about something? Does it mean coming to shared commitment to action, consent, decisions around coordination? And most of the conversation so far seems to have been about goals and decision making, which I would suggest is a subset of sense making, and one that well, I understand why people said that's critical. It also can get in the way of sense making. Premature attention to goals implies a tacit sense making that has already happened, maybe has not been spoken. So I'm going to echo what Eric said about context being really important. But the fundamental question is not at all clear to me. So I'm frustrated that we're talking about sense making with no idea or even sense of what we mean by sense.
I like that.
And I'll stop there. Frustrating enough for you, Jerry?
That's good. That's good.
Okay.
No, and I'm surprised that nobody yet has talked about how little sense we might have made over time in OGM. That I thought that would pop up pretty early because I'm a little frustrated by that.
Well, what do you mean by sense, Jerry?
I think we've had a very nice series of salon conversations that occasionally connect people, that occasionally put ideas we haven't heard of on the table,
Mhm.
but we haven't done much sense making.
What do you mean by sense making? I'm sorry, I don't mean to be
But
an ass here, but I don't know what you mean by sense or sense making or what you're frustrated about, and I don't come to OGM for sense making. So carry
and
on.
if you'll give me a moment, I'm trying to head there.
Okay.
So I was first going to do a round of what are our frustrations with sense making and see what shows up, what we put on the table. Then I was going to ask, what is evidence that sense making has happened?
Mhm.
What tells you individually, just personally, that some sense making happened, or in when you show up somewhere, when you look at something, when you see an artifact, and you're like, oh, that's really good sense making. And I'm sure this is going to be pretty particular to each of us. Like we'll have different opinions, but I'm very interested in what means sense making happen. What are the remainders? What is the evidence of it? And I was going to head from there back into what might we do about it and how do we operate and all those kinds of things. But we're sort of jumping straight in there. But Gil, I share your
Jerry,
frustration.
you're being very hard on yourself. I think you and I both think sense making is something that is documented in a document. It's slides, it's a report,
Not
and
always.
OGM has not written things, but several of us have used the wisdom of this crowd to write some very good stuff. So I think you need to look at the broader ecosystem that you've engendered.
Thank you. And I really appreciate that. Let me go to the queue and see what y'all think. But that's kind of where I was heading with the discussion, because I want to address skills issue, but I think we can't get there like immediately directly until we've talked about some of these other things. Doug.
So my biggest frustration, sidestepping the issue of what you mean by sense making and Gil's issue, is that this always starts at chapter 3 or 4, and it doesn't really contend with the fundamental ingredients at play. So, first of all, anything modified by the word collective in front of it is a major annoyance for me, frustration for me, because the minute you start voicing collective, it's sort of like use of the word we by somebody speaking. You posit this aggregate thing that doesn't really exist. And then you set up the pretext for a general feeling of failure because it doesn't really exist, but it becomes this sort of conceptualized ideal. But The we, which also doesn't exist, never arrives there. So it's sort of like out of the box, let's set up a premise for failure. And then, do the mosh pit metaphoric, cockfighting as to who wins and who's right. So just to sort of like, raise the fundamentals, when that happens, what it also does is it implicitly zeroes out and negates the concept of inclusion. It negates the concept of individual agency. And it turns things into consensus / collective agreement or alignment around a proposition, rather than the concept of arriving at consent by all individuals involved to whatever a conclusory proposition or action or intention is. And to arrive at consent means creating the generosity in the space for all voices to be heard, for all turbulence or triggers to be processed and handled, and for people to arrive at a place where there is a general shared understanding of the same it at the center that's being discussed or wrestled to ground. And 99% of the conversations, interactions, and gatherings like this that I experience do that. And it's a major frustration because the essentials of listening, of receiving, of respecting, appreciating, and supporting individuals in co-creating together and formulating together and synthesizing together are considered not relevant and not allowable because in the name of efficiency and getting to a result. Like, we can't do that because it'll take too long. We'll never get to an output or a product. And with that, I'm complete.
Thanks, Doug. It feels like you've put a whole bunch of fish on the table that I can't quite distinguish from the others, some of which I disagree with. Like, I think collective intelligence is not a malapropism or a misnomer or a whatever. I think it's actually possible. And I put in the chat Quaker sense of the meeting, which is a method that Quakers use to discuss issues. And then there's the clerk, which is a randomly assigned position, will say, I think we have sense of the meeting at some point, when not necessarily everybody has been heard from, but there's just, and they will report back what they think the meeting holds at that moment. And Quakers use that as decision making. Quakers don't believe in oath taking or voting, which makes it, harder in normal democratic or group function where, like, oh, I'll put dot voting or something. And dot voting on ideas is, I've seen kill more good concepts in my life than I care to enumerate. And then you're also talking about the pressures of time in the name of efficiency. We're going to have to skip a whole bunch of things that we should skip. And I'm like, I feel like my 27 years of feeding my brain is sense making, and I don't feel like I'm under a deadline or pressure to do it. I feel like I make it public in order to have some kind of conversations that aren't necessarily materializing. I can count on one hand the people who have approached me and seem to understand what I've done with my brain and engage me in conversations like that. But it's my earnest attempt to do that, and I do that every single day. But it's a slow process that metabolizes information, that connects, that links, that leaves behind an artifact, which is a little bit why I'm sort of like, Mike was like, well, we think that it's a report or a product. I'm not so sure. I think sense making can just be an agreement or a sense that something happened, or if anybody's heard the word scenius, It's the idea that there can be a group of people that achieve something really special and they have a sense of genius that happened in that scene, in that space. I think that's interesting. And that might be a form of sense making too. I think, and here I'm thinking maybe my sense of sense making is very broad and might be broader than most of us on the call. I don't know. But maybe a hive of bees is sense making where the food gradient is going to send them next, and like which of the little pods to feed to make the next queen, kind of thing. That's a form of collective sense making. And if you read Kropotkin, the scary anarchist, he's busy studying how nature comes to decisions that work out pretty well. I'm like, that's pretty cool. Sounds like sense making to me, with no conversation going on, right? Or some other forms of communication. Anyway. And Gil has something about bees. Is it a problem with bees, or is it bee sting that you want to report in?
No, it's an insight about bees I just learned the other day, and someday tell me why you call Kropotkin scary, but that's for another time.
Oh, that was totally irony. That was totally
Oh,
irony.
thank you. Okay.
Yeah,
Because I'm a big fan.
me too.
So people know about the bee dance.
The bee
Bees,
waggle.
the bee waggle. Bees go out and find places where there's pollen and come back to the hive and do what's called a dance, or a waggling that is, sense making, or certainly communication of information about where the food is, and efficiently guides the hive, the worker bees in the hive, to go find the food and bring stuff back to the colony. But it turns out that 10 to 20% of the bees do not do that, do not follow the instructions. And it's critically important that they do that. The deviance is essential. Without it, the hive would die. So part of the sense-making process is the outliers that do not accept the consensus, that go their own way, that go off the ideal, efficient, so-called optimized path and find other stuff.
So are you suggesting that we rename Open Global Mind the Deviant Bee Laboratory?
Well, we've got, we'll fight over biological metaphors. We've got the big fungus, and we've got the bee laboratory, and we'll have to make some sense of that some other time.
I like that. Thanks, Gil.
Okay.
Marc-Antoine.
So much to get into. I wanted to react to the notion that there's no such thing as collective intelligence. I'm a big fan of the work of Hugo Mercier, who's basically claiming that human cognition evolved as collective cognition, not as individual cognition, and makes a solid argument that the cognitive biases are actually very good heuristics in a collective context and absolutely unjustifiable in an individual cognition context. Mm-hmm. Now, that said, other points were made with which I agree much more. Like, there is a danger of premature convergence. That is totally a thing. There is a danger of, and the definition of us is do we agree us exists? And that's always a big issue. Like when I mentioned this definition of collective sensing, sense making, and so on, but was the collective the existence of the collective is totally a presupposition. And yet all cognition happens in interaction. That is what I'm going to propose. There is, now of course that means the group is always being renegotiated. Who's the insider, outsider, the inclusion, and putting the emphasis on inclusion was really important. Boundaries matter. And that said, I said my frustration put at the top of the chat was, one thing I find terrible is illusion of consensus. When we think we agree and it's actually way too fuzzy to be meaningful and to be actionable and to be precise. That is also a problem. And yeah, the group can be a temptation to say, oh, we all agree, and there's such a thing as groupthink, and following the group and saying we agree and being agreeable to the group. So that is absolutely a real risk. And yes, outliers matter for that. And a shared purpose is defined by the group. It's not already there. It's something that emerges from the negotiation. And the groups congregate around a shared action when the action emerges from all these yes, individual, but mostly happening in negotiation consensus. And so the group is as much pre-existing as the product of the negotiation of goals and meanings, shared or not, and negotiated in action. And the group is also characterized by a certain practice. I said it's the action that defines the group, and it's the tradition that makes the group exist through time. It's the transmission of a certain way of doing things that makes the group exist and have a boundary. And again, it may splinter, it may evolve, all kinds of things may happen. But what defines a group? It's a shared practice, and as such, it's again crystallized. The crystallized result of a prior sense making that ideally should be constantly renegotiated. Over.
Thanks, Marco. John. Mr. Jones, and if you don't mind, Kevin, my external perception of your life, in some sense, if I could just riff on this at this moment, is that you are kind of on a gradient sense-making mission in your life, because you keep trying to find your way to what works, and you bump into stuff, and you're like, well, you know, you did a nice job getting out of the .com implosion, and then you went into philanthropy, and then you're like, well, shit, this is not working. There's all sorts of things broken with philanthropy. So you created an environment where you could invite in a whole mess of people, which becomes SOCAP, and sort of explore that area. And then you leave that behind. You need to go build a new nest. But I perceive you as always like heading toward this thing you have in your head that is sense making, personal, about what's going to work.
Well, interesting. Yeah, I see myself as a truffle hound. You know, I have that much.
That's a way to say the same thing.
Yeah, you know, I go sniff out what's next. But you know, I've been reading a marathon of Ursula Le Guin's Hainish cycle, which is about getting out of slavery. And you know, sense making leads to definitions, which is a great. The first tool of the colonizer is sense making to definitions that validates land grabs and saying who's an asset and who's a person. And so I think, you know, it's which is, you know, obviously happening with ICE now and those kinds of things. And I think sense making has been more a tool of the conqueror than, yeah, I think it is sense making. It totally is sense making. It makes sense for them. No, it's sense making. Okay, I'm not going to argue with your chats. Sorry.
Okay.
They say this is what is. That's what makes it happen. And this is without. And so, you know, there was a revolt on the planet Yao where the women said, we are no longer assets. And the men came along and then they said, oh, but it is a patriarchy. And they said, well, no, that won't work either. But it was sense making leads to the powerful having the power to define. And, you know, if you look at all land extractions, you know, the Marshall Trilogy that made Native Americans a dependent nation, that therefore their land can't be an asset and they can't get a mortgage on it and they can't get intergenerational wealth, was completely like redlining that, you know, African Americans couldn't get a government mortgage after the Depression and they couldn't get it after being in World War II with the GI Bill. So sense making leads to a definition of the powerless by the powerful.
So Kevin, that was highly unexpected from my perspective, and I'm going to refuse to let you taint the word sense making that deeply in my head. Others may go with you on this, but I could say that speech enables the powerful to have the power to define. Oh my God, we should just cancel speech. We should never talk about speech because all these people who've used speech to control us, they're just bad people. And look what effect that's happened in our lives. It's the source of all colonialism. It's the source of all bad things that have happened. And like, not really. It's particular uses of sense or speech or whatever, right?
Yeah. That's a really stupid thing to have just said, okay? Because the people rose up.
Sorry, Kevin, why did you say that way?
I shouldn't have said it that way.
Why did you say that way exactly?
Because I thought it was a gross misunderstanding of what I said.
Maybe it was a provocation or something, but why did you say it that way?
Because I thought it was a gross misunderstanding of what I said, taking it to someplace where it never was and shouldn't have been, And it was so, it just rubbed me wrong. And I shouldn't have called it stupid. I should have called it.
You didn't call it stupid. You sort of called me stupid.
Jerry, you've now asked him 4 times. He's answered 3 times.
Okay.
Let's get escape velocity here.
I did not like that intervention. I was trying to move your idea into a different spot and see what it provoked, but it certainly didn't mean to provoke that.
Could I try something here?
Yes, please.
Kevin, I hear what you're saying, and but it seems that the women on whatever Le Guin's planet was or whatever are sense making also. It seems that the people being colonized are sense making also.
They claimed their voice.
Well, that's sense making too. So you're using the word in a very particular way of how sense making is used by dominators, as opposed to sense making itself. I think that's how I'm hearing you. Because we're all about you, in fact, in speaking what you spoke, we're doing a bit of sense making. In other words, sharing an interpretation that you have formed out of your experience.
Okay.
Yeah.
So let's not get stuck on this. I'm sorry.
Sense making is a tool of the powerful.
Which I totally disagree with. If you read Caste by Isabel Wilkerson, she's like, what happens is somebody comes in, creates an artificial distinction, reinforces that artificial distinction in a community, and that causes all kinds of shit that is how you create a colonial power structure that works. And I totally agree that that's happened over and over again. I don't think that was sense making. I think that was redefining words for everybody and then applying value, differential value that normally would not make sense to any of the participants in the community, but that they are forced to live under. And for me, none of that was sense making. It was reestablishing. It was like, in Taming of the Shrew, there's the moon in the sky, and everybody's like, no, shit, that's the sun. And it's like, oh, if we don't say that to the moon, we die. We don't get food. We don't get married. We don't get anything. So I kind of get where it goes. But to me, that's not sense making, and we can leave the debate on the word for a second if we want. There's a bit of a queue that's been quite patient. So how about Klaus?
Yeah, so maybe because of my German upbringing and background, when I hear the word collective, it rings a completely different bell than what this conversation has been going on for so far, right? And then you initiated the conversation saying collective intelligence, but somehow we morphed into sense making, which is a completely different topic again. And it's connected, but so collective intelligence really is like a mass movement, right? I mean, I'm thinking of herds of waves when I see collective. You have a consensus building where people maintain the same opinion, maintain a worldview that moves them into action. And that's what we're seeing right now, right? So particularly within the context of our current environment, our political environment, this is a pretty ominous kind of state that we are in, where collective intelligence is being manipulated, to create a worldview that has people do things in groups that are rather harmful. So that's where, and I've posted a couple articles on a definition of intelligence. First of all, what do we mean by intelligence from a technical perspective, and then what are the influences of collective? And I'm really emphasizing that the conversation should be on what is collective, not in what is intelligence or sense making, but what does it mean within the context of collective, right? Because that's where we are right now, and that's an extremely dangerous moment in time, and we're completely skirting the topic.
Klaus, thank you for the warning about how collective hits you because of your background. That's super useful. And my intent with starting this call was both personal sense making and collective, but the thing I'm most interested in is the collective part of it, like you just said. But I think without us on our own little sense making quests, we don't get good collective intelligence in some sense, but I don't feel strongly about what I just said. Mr. Mooring, please, who has been trying to help us make sense out of things with DSRP and other frameworks over time and showing us his experiments. And please.
Hello, everyone. So one of my themes has been how the individuals aggregate to the group. And when we talk about collective, there is, in a sense, collective is the aggregation, I believe, of all the individuals. And I kind of have been taught to think about it as a bunch of people on a beach in a giant clear plastic ball, and they're all walking inside the ball. And it's sort of, where does the ball go? Well, there might be some who are trying to go this way, but most of them are going this way. So the ball generally follows that vector. And the reason I bring that up is that I've been thinking about why we think, which is why we make a mental model, which is our sense making, our collective, our intelligence, if you will. And the conclusion I came to, and this is just kind of my own, is we want to interpret the past so we can predict the future, so we can decide and act. And so the whole reason to make sense or to have a collective intelligence is to inform our predictions and our actions. And I think that that's an interesting way of thinking about it for me. And I'm not sure others will riff on this, but I just wanted to throw that out there, that a mental model is a prediction, and a collective intelligence, to my way of thinking, is a mental model held by a collective. So.
Thank you, Scott. Mark-Antoine, real quick.
The absolutely agreed. Sense making is partly a mental model and a mental model update, but it's a storytelling, and a story, in a way, it's a simplified version of the model. It's what can fit in a brain of a very complex world, and it's also about negotiating shared sense of provenance and purpose. There's a prediction as utilitarian, let's get to a goal, and there's a prediction as a sense of being somebody, a certain kind of person, in a certain kind of group, and that is the other side of sense making. It's also feeding identity as well as action, purposeful action. Over.
Thank you. Doug.
I sort of wanted to loop around. I wanted to loop back to the difference between sensing, which is a thing that I do as a human being and other human beings do, versus sense making. And the shift into sense making, one man's sense is another's nonsense. And that was you, and that was you and Kevin in that moment. And the difference between things that are susceptible and intrinsic to being subjective versus the ingredients of humans as living beings, and the way I experience, the way I receive and take in information, the way I respond to that, and the way I respond to others. There are the sort of the ingredients and dimensions of that, but then there's the transformation of all of that into beliefs, into frameworks and protections and attachments and constructs, which are all products of mind. They're not of reality, they're of mind. And I would argue that the Quakers aren't sense making, they're sensing in that meeting form. And I think, you know, I align with what Mark just shared in terms of understanding, which is individual, and with others. So coming to a common understanding of whatever, fill in the blank, is intrinsically, you know, an evolving and elaborative process.
So it's a cliffhanger.
I just muted Rick.
You know, is an elaborative process and is a constantly changing one. The delusion like addiction that seems to prevail culturally around fixing understandings in a moment of time and then playing them forward and believing that they control future to be rather than the future to be being the dog and us being the tail is the challenge. And we love our constructions and our models and our frameworks and our stuff. But the truth of the matter is that we don't have any control over what happens next. And the world we're living in is sort of a living example that that's the case. So I'm complete at that.
Thanks, Doug. Kevin.
Well, again, I'll apologize for my overreaction. It just felt like you were doing violence to my idea, and I just was a limbic reaction. But I'm with Doug on collective and making, and I think to me, sense making feels like you want to come out with a toaster when I think you should come out with you should have sniffed a sock that leads you down a trail. And so the collective is always, you know, the group is a conspiracy against the outlier. One of the reasons I knew SOCAP would succeed is I started going to people, should there be a conference like this? And another guy said, you know, well, there were two groups. Okay, this story has a point. There was a group led by Tides and one led by Aspen Institute, and they were trying to define this thing. And I said, I'll do a conversation map between them and how they define it versus you, because nobody could agree on what to call it, and they were fighting over definitions. And then they said, oh, you know, there's only 10 minutes worth. Then they said, there's no time. And they said, well, don't you want to know what the people who are not in the room are saying? And they said, no, we think we have the right people in the room. And I said, oh, what a great market opportunity. You know, when you have the right people in the room, you have a summit. And what we needed was a marketplace where the Byzantine and the barbarian could discover each other as unlikely allies. And fortunately for me, they all went to good schools and had flown business class to their families' vacations. And so they were not ready for somebody to say, no, these folks that are outsiders to you need to be brought in, and we can explain why they can be unlikely allies. So, you know, sense making is not a toaster. That's all.
There's our bumper sticker. Mike, bumper sticker alert. Sense making is not a toaster. Dave.
Yeah, I mean, I think I just wanted to throw in, like, well, I think of it probably data points, but I mean, I was Mark, you said something about in the chat, I think, about the individual doesn't exist and except to the individual, you know. And I do think we're kind of caught between sense making as an individual effort, you know, I'm trying to make sense versus sense making as a collective effort, which is I'm trying to make shared sense. And the shared sense, I think, is where it's real. The idea that trying to convince people is violence is, I think, more often in the shared sense space. And I was struck. My wife is working at Cal, And the new students are coming on to campus this week, and she was doing an exercise where she was asking them to talk about their strengths. And she said she heard from a lot of them that they had a strength which was listening. And she thought it was interesting that was, such a prominent strength, that I asked her if anybody said their strength was debating, and nobody says that anymore. And I swear that's an era change thing, right? I mean, listening is a modern skill set. I'm pretty sure, that in a big chunk of, CPAC and stuff, debating is still a strong force. But they have different effects on the sense making, right? And then the other one thing I've been going, I just came back from Vermont, and in Vermont where we go to the lake, there's this big Amish community. So you have this Amish community that has this sense of their culture living surrounded by this Vermont, traditional white kind of whatever Vermont community is. And they're quite distinct, but they're still coherent, right? So they have two very different senses, but they both work. So I think this notion of an ultimate sense is probably a flawed notion, right? There's many of them out there. It's kind of enough cooperation or something that you don't end up killing each other. And then maybe the last data point was just when I was listening to this Zach Bush interview yesterday, trying to figure out what he means. And one of these observations was that we don't have to worry about AI, because AI will never be able to understand the way humans do, because AI has been trained on words. And I think it's that map and the territory kind of idea. We've trimmed words of a whole bunch of their meaning, so we say, oh, the sky is blue, but the sky is blue. It's, this wonderful, all this stuff that's going on up there. We use the word blue, and it's so simple, and AI will never understand all of the beauty, and so it'll always have lost some of the sense of whatever it is we're experiencing. And I felt really good about that for about 3 minutes, and then I realized that, well, the AIs are going to be able to suck in all the satellite data in a bunch of different dimensions that I can never experience. So still, the AI is going to be able to sense in many more dimensions than I can sense. So we should still probably be afraid of the AI. But I do think that we do in our effort to have joint sense making, the colonialism part of it is this creating of the map problem, right? Where we simplify ideas so that we can then share them. But when we do that, we've lost some of the sense.
Dave, thank you. I think one of the pet peeves we haven't mentioned so far that you just put on the table is oversimplification. It's like sometimes in order to get agreement, we use a word that is simpler but kind of good enough or whatever, and we miss it. And one of my personal beliefs about this is that, excuse me, two people can never really agree completely on anything. There isn't twins born and raised the same are going to have a different understanding of some setting, context, sentence, whatever it might be, and it'll be colored by the last thing they read, whatever it might be. We can never ever get 100% overlap. What we can get is close to good enough agreement where major things aren't going to destroy the thing that's important to what we're agreeing on. And that definitionally, we've chased down enough of the weasel words or words that might mean different things to different people. Sorry, short story. A really long time ago, when I launched a service in 1990 for New Science called Intelligent Document Management, our VP of Sales came back from a meeting with IBM completely worried. And he had my issue of the review of Image Plus, IBM's imaging offer, all marked up in red. And he had just come back with a meeting with Dave Liddell. So I wound up a week later having a call with this VP at IBM, Dave Liddell, and he starts out very thoughtfully. And he says, Jerry, I think maybe we mean different things by the same words. And I'm like, what do you mean? He says, well, in your write-up, you said that Image Plus was neither open nor strategic. And to us, anything that's that big an offer in the product lineup is strategic. And anything that offers even a tiny little window where you could poke in data and pull out data is open. And to me, open is like open source. And strategic means it's actually strategic for the business in some way. And we had a delightful conversation, and he became my client. He signed up for my intelligent document management service. That was one of my early lessons in this. Oh, wow. Sometimes we mean very different things. And sometimes the context of the word is political internally, and the internal context and the politics of it don't let you see very useful contexts that other people have for the same damned word, et cetera, et cetera. And we haven't even opened that can. Anyway, there's so much interesting territory here. Jack, thank you for your patience.
Well, and thank you for that segue, Jerry, because what I wanted to talk about is, first of all, at the highest level, sense making to me is the left side of theory U. It's the side where you do the sensing and you organize all the data. And now I want to go into collective intelligence, but I first want to ground the term intelligence in the fact that all biological entities, all organismic entities, are model builders. And basically, sense making turns out to be as much sensing on the data in front of you as it is aligning the models in the room. And this goes to collective intelligence. And so intelligence, in my view, as a model builder, is how you deal with expectation failures. Think about it. If you are anticipating, your model is predicting the future, and the future doesn't happen the way you expect it, how do you deal with it? That's a degree of intelligence. It's like the young child that first encounters a large, ugly bug. How they deal with it is they run screaming to mom. Um, but eventually, as they learn more and build a bigger model about what the bugs are, they don't run screaming to mom anymore. They may actually pick it up and hold it and look at it or whatever. I mean, I remember my son uh, at, I don't know, maybe a year and a half old, walking over in Tennessee and noticing a gigantic, very, very bright blue beetle. And he walked over and picked it up. He wasn't afraid of it. He had a different model of the world than I do. I wouldn't go near it. It was just a beetle, but to me, it was ugly as hell. So through my model of the universe, collective sense making is how the collective deals with the differences in their models and the oncoming input streams. And I'm going to use that just for a moment. Sorry to drag you sideways, and talk about Marc Antoine's hyper knowledge. Hyper knowledge is about this. I'm channeling Marc Antoine, not putting words in his mouth, and he'll likely correct me, and that's okay. That's what sense making is about. But my understanding of Marc Antoine is that you have an ecosystem of a platform which deals with multiple input streams and allows agents of all kinds to play with those streams as if they were get repos. And and I think that that's a model of what the brain does. So I I've gone and reduced collective intelligence and all of that to Marc Antoine's hyper knowledge, which is incorrect, but it's my sense of what's going on. Over.
Thanks, Jack. Klaus.
Yeah, along those same lines, I mean, I love Theory U, and I've been an ardent student of it. Intelligence really needs some definition, I think, because it really depends on the information that you have and the context that you live within. So, for example, a farmer can be incredibly intelligent about his soil, his land, the influence of climate, water, soil conditions. You can have a craftsman who works with a material, let's say with wood, who looks at this wood, touches it, and feels things about what he can create with this wood by carving it that completely escapes anyone else. So is that intelligence? So there are layers of intelligence. So as we make decisions as a collective about farming, for example, is the decision-making body really informed and knowledgeable about what's happening in that soil, yet make decisions that may completely alienate this farmer away from his soil? So there is a hierarchy in intelligence, that has to be built from the ground on up into more narrative types of intelligence, and I think that's where you would need an unbiased, unfettered, intentional form of intelligence that is collective, meaning being respectful, to every layer of intelligence that needs to be combined into a common understanding. And I think we are missing that. And there is a certain arrogance in our decision-making process, in our political decision-making process, that is so far removed from the reality of the natural world, but just assumes that it knows. And so it's that, Donald Meadows, the hierarchy of a system where in every layer of that hierarchy, there is an embedded intelligence that needs to be heard, and that needs to be embedded and incorporated. And so I think that's what we're struggling with right now, because we have become our collective intelligence is so far removed, from what I would just maybe frame as reality, the natural world, that we have gotten into a lot of trouble.
Thanks, Klaus. Let's, Mark Antoine, I know you'd like to jump in. Let's take a short silence break, and I'll bring us back in, and you can jump in. So let's just be silent with this for a bit. We've been going hot and heavy for an hour.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. I'm intrigued and a little bit worried that all this interest in generative AI has caused conversations about intelligence, consciousness, et cetera, to just bubble over. I mean, that pot is boiling over right now in interesting ways and places. But over to you, Marc-Antoine.
Thanks for breaking the rhythm, because it is a matter of rhythm, isn't it? I want to build over what Klaus was saying, right? We have a problem with hubris and arrogance. We necessarily deal with simplified models of the world because limited cognitive capacity. And believing that our map is the territory is hubris. And for me, the whole point of collective sense making is the act of triangulation and checking, I have this map of the world that's necessarily partial. And let's compare maps a bit to see what I may have missed, or what you may have missed, or what we may all have missed. And it's a practice. The ability to listen, the ability to not hold fast to our conclusions, to our map, the habit of checking the rigidity of our assumptions and the emotional stake we have in our beliefs, and how we often bind it to our identity. I spoke of identity earlier. There's a positive sense of identity. Sometimes identity is what makes us remember to act in ways that are pro-social. And sometimes identity is what makes us cling to a parochial view of the world. And again, it's all a practice of questioning and of taking the time to question, why do I believe this? And I believe strongly in collective sense making as an arena where we may stop and listen and be confronted to other perspectives, because that's important. That's it. I wanted to go in the practice and learning. For me, there's a pedagogy of sense making, and that's something we're working on with Jack with SenseCraft. It's, can we make it into a game? And the question of tempo is not fully addressed yet, but something I care deeply about. What is the tempo of reading through what somebody else has said and penetrating it and trying to, okay, what does that mean? What does that mean to me? How can I not just react, but build on and integrate what was said? Over.
Thank you. Dave.
Yeah, I was thinking of maybe Mark and Jerry, what you'd said about AI, that my thought is that the sense making is collective, but the sense is individual. And one of the problems is trying to remember that the sense is individual, right? Because we then adopt our map and assume it's reality, and we forget that it isn't, and we have to go back and forth and re-update that. And so then the violence comes when we try to take our individual sense and force other people to understand it or to adopt it, or which I think may be a critique of politics, Mike, recently, that, the technocracy was the effort of the elite to force a whole bunch of people to understand, democracy, the good life, a whole bunch of things in a way that they had decided was best, and then impose it through policy. And we're seeing a reaction to that, which is, I don't care how bad it is, but you're not going to tell me what it should be. But I was thinking, Jerry, I mean, and I don't know, I don't want to take you off the sense making stream, but I also feel like this group is not only about sense making, right? Sense making is one of the things that we do collectively. And I was thinking, actually, the AI is a thing, it's going to be there. To me, one of the forces that will be balancing against AI is human connection. And I think we've been undervaluing human connection. Ken, we need you, back in this game, kind of, because we have a whole bunch of technologies that support human connection. And human connection does sense making as one of its things, but there's so many things that human connection does, right? It's a fundamental relationship. And I think we've I would say, in a societal way, I mean, perhaps we have this is maybe it's Putnam and social capital kinds of analysis, right? But we have a lot of skills and techniques that kind of reinforce and strengthen human connection. And I actually think OGM, one of the really magical things about it is this collection of people who know so much about human connection, getting together and connecting with each other. But we actually could be much more devoted to the idea of increasing connection, right? I mean, that there's tools, there are ideas, there's experiences that we have that are really special that I think could really make a contribution to global human connection, which we're really going to want.
Dave, thank you. Let's just be quiet with that for just a second. It's worth sitting with. You also made me think that human connection is sometimes a shortcut to sense making, meaning if I bond with somebody in whatever way, and I really trust them, and something they do makes me realize that their advice or point of view on things is good, I will slide over and adopt a lot of their points of view, a lot of the sense making that I infer from what they say and do, and happily, inhabit that space. I think it's the trusted connection is a shortcut or a shorthand to the logical process of making your way through facts or whatever it is. And then earlier I was thinking that there's some sense making that has nothing to do with facts and logic. It's all about story and connection, and those are important as well. Those are a form of sense making as well. Mike.
A lot of richness there. And some of the previous comments, I don't think I've ever seen so much material in the chat, or so much good material. I just wanted to add on to that idea that human connection is sort of the foundation, and say that one way we make sense and share sense is through stories. And a lot of them aren't true. A lot of them are fairy tales. I mean, the truth in the Bible is probably more in the stories of how humans have interacted and how there might be some greater power than it is in the specific principles that you're supposed to live your life around. I mean, Deuteronomy is not a good outline to define how you live your life, but some of the parables of Jesus, like the Good Samaritan, I think are. So I hope that at some point we'll spend more time on powerful untruths or powerful untruth narratives. And that is what the MAGA people have done so well. I mean, they know full well that the Haitians weren't eating dogs, but boy, that was a story that they all told each other, and it had the added virtue of owning the libs and making them upset that such a lie would go so far and influence so many people. So I just want to. I talked earlier about how sense often is reflected in a negotiated document. I think sense is also more powerfully conveyed in a story. And I'll just finish with one reference, one footnote. One of the most powerful things I've ever read in the Harvard Business Review, more than 15 years old, is called The CEO as Storyteller. And it's a brilliant 7 or 8 page essay with lots of examples of how by changing the way a company thought, by telling just a couple stories, CEOs can change the game, particularly a new CEO who's coming in to fix a big mess. Over.
Thanks, Mike. I didn't test that link. I hope it still works. But that should be the article at HBS.
It's broken. I gave another one. I'm not sure it's the right one.
Well, thank you. Well, this was an article by Bronwyn Fryer and Robert McKee called Happy Tales. I'll put the title in and then we can find a good link and I'll correct the link in my brain. Thanks. Rick.
Yeah, I've been using my silence to use co-intelligence about collective intelligence and the wisdom of the crowd. And I came up with I was just asking questions to AI as we're going through. And this is very crude because typically when you do something like that, you form a question, you formulate, you iterate on it. But so this is just a sort of about 10 questions that came to mind. And we don't have time to do justice to any of them. But I think it speaks to how to create an inquiry mind. And, Mike, last week we talked about the meaning of hen, and you were encouraging me to simplify it. And actually, I think I've come up with a good rationale for not doing it and just calling it 10. Because, you know, I got sort of lambasted by 3 people by saying, I got to simplify it, simplify, simplify it. That's the KISS principle. Yes, it has its merit, but I think somebody said during this conversation that sometimes when you simplify a word, it loses some of the original meaning. And so the construct of this learning process is different to what we're experiencing now. And I'll put a link into that if people are curious about a different type of learning method that goes against the grain of what we've been taught. And the whole purpose of it actually is to shift from fast thinking to slow thinking. Because most of the time we're in these groups, we pause a little bit. We may do a little slow thinking, but it's sort of rapid fire, you know, communication, and it doesn't allow space. So the slow thinking can happen afterwards. But one thing I haven't done yet, and I was wondering if anybody else has had, but Plexity has the capacity of doing group work. And I was wondering whether anybody's had an experience with it, because what I just shared could be something that could be group work. People who'd look at the questions, you know, disagree or whatever it is and try and prove it. But, you know, there are people who are still remain highly skeptical of AI and what it can do for us. But what I think it's good at is lowering the floor of ignorance so that we can actually raise our collective wisdom. And it can scope things out far quicker. I mean, for example, through this conversation, one thing that kept ricocheting through my mind was sociocracy. Now, that's just one method of dealing with, it's a different methodology for thinking about how groups can work together, where it's not consensus, it's consent. And that's different. That means everyone's objections to whatever's agreed is honored. You build some middle ground where you say, is this good enough to move forward? And then you can iterate based upon what your experiences of doing wicked problems, such that the outlier may have had the most important contribution but got marginalized. And it may come to pass that that person's contribution was the most important, so it can be incorporated in. So I think there's different frameworks of sociocracy, and there's different people have been, you know, have different frames for what collective means. I mean, Klaus's frame of collective is different to some of other people's. And if we don't define the terms, then people's negative or positive connotations to the words are going to get, it's going to affect the flow of the conversation. Anyway, I'll put the link in for Hen. And if people are interested, it's 25 modules there, and it's a course that I'm developing for enabling people to develop their slow thinking skills. I'm Rick, and I'm done speaking.
Thank you, Rick. Klaus.
Yeah, I've done some work with biodynamics, and I've been into understanding this and worked with AI, you know, to take a deep dive into using spiral dynamics as a communications tool. So you can play with that by taking a concept and explaining and spinning that concept out at a high cognitive level, and then explain that same concept going through the spiral, going through, you know, the green, orange, red, blue, red stages, and see how you know, using AI, how it adapts this message to these different stages of cognition. And clearly, the story loses part of it. You know, if you are trying to explain to, I mean, I don't mean to put any qualitative into this, but let's say you go to a worker, you know, with a high school education, and you try to explain, you know, a concept that comes from a science perspective. you have to illustrate it in ways where it lives within the context of the person you're communicating with. So the same is true if you're communicating with a farmer. You know, the conceptual expression is stiff, has to be adapted to that farmer. If you insist on keeping your language at the level that is, you know, where you are or where someone you're listening to is, and not wanting to change it because you don't want to lose anything, what you do is you lose the person you want to communicate with because they don't get anything. So there is a need to adapt, you know, to the stages and the cognitive development of your audience. And that's coming back to Donella Meadows. I mean, that's clearly, you know, what the pyramid of a system, what she is saying. You know, you have to adjust to each stage and speak the language of that stage in order to be heard and in order to hear as well. You know?
Thanks, Klaus. I think that this notion of the work you've done to adapt the messages you have to people at different levels in the spiral dynamics model is very much some sort of adaptive sense making or something like that. You're trying to connect to different people who might have different priorities, values, et cetera, and so you've asked the AIs to help you change the wording and the metaphors and everything done so that it might click for different audiences. It's been really fascinating to watch. I appreciate that. Let me ask a question that came up a little bit earlier in this call, which is, and I know that sense making is one of the things that OGM is nominally meant to do. Are we doing enough of it? Should we do more of it? Should we change how we do it? I'm happy to. I did, I think, only once. I don't think I did this twice. Maybe I did it two calls, but I challenged people to show up with their own sense making tools. And we talked about something for 20 minutes, and then we compared notes on how we had made sense of the conversation with, you know, people screen sharing their own note taking and so forth. I could have gone back and done that a dozen times and seen if we got really good at it or if we developed some practices out of it. Interested in those kinds of things. I'm very pleased that this call got a lot of interest from y'all. That people I haven't seen in a while showed up. That's great. But what do you think, Gil?
I think I'm not interested in it for the reasons that I asked at the top of the call. After 83 minutes of this, I still don't know what we mean by sense and what we mean by sense making. And I think what we're meaning by sense making is coming to common interpretations about things, which is, you know, maybe a useful thing to do, but maybe not. Again, the B deviance. And Ken's recent comment about how narrow the scope of this community is raises the question of what, you know, what's the value of sense making if our senses and our experience and our perceptions are so undiverse, if that's a word. How can we make sense of the world that we're in with such a narrow experience of the world that we're in?
And I don't think I saw Ken say that, so that's news to me.
Check the chat.
Thank you. There was so much chat that, yeah.
There's a lot of chat, a couple minutes back.
Yeah.
The observation, with the exception of Stacy, everyone on this call is male, all are white, all are highly educated. I think all are over 45. And all of us use and all embedded in and acculturated to the social norms of the global north. So the sense making that is taking place here is lacking the diversity of gender, ethnicity, and global south experiences and thinking. This is a tiny sample to explore sense making with.
And thanks for reading that into the recording. I appreciate that as well.
Yeah, I think it's an important observation, and it goes to my question about and I don't mean to be the wise guy saying this, Jerry. I mean, it's really true to me in the moment. It's a kind of sense making that I'm doing, that I don't know what we're trying to do here.
Which is a question maybe for next week. And I don't want to.
No, I don't mean what we're trying to do with OGM in general. I love what we're
Yeah.
doing with OGM in general, whatever the hell it is. And I keep coming
Okay.
back to this, and I'm pruning my Zoom groups, my calendar, and this one stays. So that's
Sweet.
clear. Let me tongue in cheek call it this obsession with sense making. I don't understand that. And
Oh, okay.
I put in the chat a conversation that Ken and I hosted 2 years ago called "Stop Making Sense Making," and invite people to have a look. With homage, of course, to David Byrne.
And exactly, we have a couple people in the queue, and then possibly a poem from Ken. So we're near the end of our call time. Scott. You lowered your hand, but you didn't unmute.
I got the sense.
And whenever we unmute, if you can keep your hand up while you're talking, that keeps you up in the top near the camera for me, which I like a lot. Because the moment you unpin, you go somewhere randomly into my grid, and now I've got to hunt for you. And often you're down below, like Scott, you're down near the bottom of my screen now. So just as it going forward, if you want to keep your hand up after you unmute, that would be super and great. Go ahead, Scott.
Awesome. I got the sense that, like many of our calls, the topic of sense making went to a meta level. It was not actually about making sense. It was about talking about what sense making was, which I feel is more universal than our individual experiences of making sense. So when I read Ken's comment, I think I absolutely agree with that, with the sense that is being made, but with the topic of what is collective sense making and what is that collective intelligence, I think that this is an appropriate group.
Thanks, Scott. Rick.
Yeah, just a quick couple of things. One is that, there is the Grace One Guild that many of you probably know for sense making. There's also the Institute of General Semantics as well. And the where I would overlap with some of Gil's concerns is that you have these academic disciplines, and they go into great depth in defining them, but they're only one lens. And I think it does help to at least start off with a definition of whatever it is we're talking about, so that I can understand the differences and similarities between how people are framing sense making, whether it's at a practical level or at a meta level. And I think having that as a grounding, at least then you can you can say where you differ with the definition, then you can understand where the differences lie. So that's getting into semantics.
Thanks. And I could have begun with a couple definitions, and it might have helped you and Gil and so forth. So good point. Thank you. Marc-Antoine, was that you with your hand raised that just went down accidentally?
Yes, that was an accident. Apologies.
Go for it.
It is fascinating how we're always arguing about words, because we're always arguing with words. It comes with the territory. That's language for you. I don't understand personally, Gil, sorry, I don't understand your frustration with what do we mean by sense and what do we mean by sense making, in the sense that we're busy negotiating it and negotiating shared meaning so that we can have connection at all, have communication at all, have shared community, and maybe even act on it at some point, and learn the praxis of thinking with others, because for me it's an essential praxis, like of learning to listen, learning to see the other perspectives. And I don't expect a formal definition of sense making to emerge or be agreed on. What I do think is we're here because we have some shared goals, and having some kinds of agreement or some kinds of negotiating meaning and negotiating understanding is part of it. I choose to call that sense making. That word has obviously offended some of us because they probably attach different meaning to the word or different connotations. That's normal. That's always going to happen. We'll always have dissent over what does the word mean. And this is why I'm saying shared consensus is terrible. The illusion of consensus is terrible. We think we mean the same thing by the same word. We don't. We had a little argument about what do we mean by prediction. We had different definitions of prediction. It's fine. But it is very useful to, and there I salute your effort, Gil, to step back. What are we trying to accomplish? But the reality is, again, there won't be a definitive answer. We are each coming with our agenda. We're trying to identify what we're trying to accomplish in common from our existing individual agenda. I say there's no such thing as individual, not totally true, but all our individual agendas come from a history of collective negotiation also. I don't expect us to ever agree on a final definition, but I do think it's important to work on the definition progress to explore where the agreement lies. Over. It's about how much do we want to use words? How much do we want to rely on words?
Thanks, Marc-Antoine. Someday we should have a call without words. I think that'd be pretty cool.
Especially if we could do it with miming.
But yeah, I think we'll do the Marcel Marceau call, and everybody needs to come in whiteface and just mime what we say.
Well,
and the musicians will do jazz improv.
Yeah, we did have a chat about jazz, which is not words, but is communication and perhaps sense making.
Oh, totally.
I want to build on what Marc-Antoine was saying, actually.
Let's go back to Ken.
Okay.
A few years ago, I was doing a workshop for the National Park Service at Yosemite on conflict. And I'm very suspicious of definitions, because if my definition is different than yours, you're going to disagree with me. So there were 35 people in the room. We gave everybody a stack of Post-its and a marker and said, please write down all the words and short phrases that come to mind when you think of the word conflict. And there were over 400 responses that went up on the wall. And we had people arrange them from the least bothersome to the most bothersome. And under the most bothersome column, someone had written organ failure. And I said, who wrote organ failure? And someone raised her hand. I said, what does that mean? She said, that's when the conflict is so bad, I'm afraid I'm going to have a heart attack. I said, how many people had organ failure in your definition of conflict before? No one raised their hand. I says, how many have that now? Everybody raised their hand. So to go to Marc-Antoine's point, it's not about, this is a difference from sense making and shared meaning. We expanded the shared meaning by allowing everybody to say, this is all the shit I think about when I think about conflict. Not trying to nail it down to a fine definition, but rather let's get it all out on the table and take a look at it and say, wow, within this group, this is what it means. And if we had a group 10 times the size, there'd be even more, So it becomes expansive and exponentially synthesizing rather than reduced down to a final definition. And I think that's a much more effective way to approach something like this, where we want to get a sense of shared meaning. Over to you, Alex.
Alex.
Do we have any more time? Because I can skip this.
Go right ahead.
Okay, I'm just going to contribute in this following way. I didn't know what sense, the purpose, not the meaning, the purpose of what we were doing here. And I enjoyed the discussion, but I could not find a thread in it. And can I just say, I'm not academic in the way that I would analyze a prose and know what's going on. Like whatever, I'm a bit more practical. You say this, you mean that. So I'm not saying what you're doing is wrong. I'm just saying that's what I'm like. So listening to everything else, I was not able to say, I cannot say what it is you guys were actually. Yeah, you discuss things, you discuss sense, you discuss but I don't know what the outcome, because that's the way I'm oriented. Not because you did anything wrong. It's just I'm oriented to solutionizing. And there were no solutions here that I could see. It was just discussion about two words, sense making, and sometimes sense making as a third. And I'm not saying this to complain. I'm happy that I was here. But I didn't identify with it other than a set of people talking about what they think about those three words and the combination of it. It's not bad, I'm okay. But for a while I was lost. I thought, what are we trying to do here? Because I thought there was an objective, but obviously there isn't. It's a discussion, and I accept that. I don't have a problem with it. But I just thought I'd let you know that We're not all the same.
Absolutely. Alex, thank you for that. And we didn't even get to whether sense making should have a hyphen or not. I mean, we didn't even touch that, which clearly would have sparked another. But thank you. I think between what Ken said and what you just said, those are really nice and different bows to put on the conversation. Ken, hast thou a poem?
I do. This one's called A Note Passed to Superman by Lucille Clifton. Sweet Jesus, Superman, if I'd seen you dressed in your blue suit, I would have known you. Maybe that choir boy Clark can stand around listening to stories, but not you. Not with Metropolis to save and every crook in town filthy with kryptonite. Lord, Man of Steel, I understand the cape, the leggings, the whole ball of wax. You can trust me. There is no planet stranger than the one I'm from.
Beautiful. Beautiful. Thank you. And that made perfect sense to everyone in the same way, right?
Can I
With
introduce
that,
something just quickly?
please.
Last week's poem was brilliant. It touched me. I thought it was one of the most brilliant poems. I sent it to my wife and kids. My kids said, "Great poem." My wife said, "That's not a poem."
Wow.
Then it did its job. Then it did its job.
Can we define poem?
Hey, can we define good poem? Oh.
At this point, I wish I had some outro music that was the Twilight Zone closing, but here we go. Thanks, everybody. See you all in a week. Bye for now.
Ciao.
And someday we'll make sense of poetry. Or not.